welcome everyone to this month's Process Safety with Louise. I've prepared a short intro, so I'm going to go through that now, but I've enabled the Q&A for the session, so please do type your questions in and I will answer them when we get to the Q&A part. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. Okay. Right. So as I said, welcome to this month's Process Safety with Louise. It's a free Q&A session, but please do remember that the session is being streamed live to YouTube and will be available for playback on my YouTube channel. So just be mindful of what you say and be respectful to others. Everyone who's here is volunteering their time as well as me. So if we don't have the answer, it's not because we don't want to help. It's just perhaps we need more information. And again, if it's something that could be potentially commercially sensitive, please don't mention that on the call. We can connect afterwards. So what is Process Safety with Louise? It's a place to get access to industry experts and ask questions on specific topics once a month. It's typically the first Wednesday of each month, and we're available for catch up on the YouTube channel. And it's a place to share best practices for all of us to learn. So every time I do one of these, I learn something as well from you guys in the audience. If you have something which will help the person who's asking the question, please just put it in the chat and I'll share it with that person. So thank you all for attending and sharing your valuable experience. So now we're going to start the session. As I said, we're going to give a quick introduction and a small safety moment, then I'll open the floor for questions at 10 past 10. If you start typing the questions in before that, I'll start answering them as soon as we get there. Then I'll wrap up at 10 to 11. Unless there's no more questions, we may wrap up early. And then I will see you again next month. So a quick introduction to myself, just in case you don't know who I am. My name is Louise Whiting, and I have worked for over 11 years in two major operators in process and process safety roles. I now operate my own business, Barberton Limited, and as part of operating this business, I started this initiative to give an hour a month to people so that they can have their process safety questions answered. So these sessions are for you guys on the call. So if you don't answer questions, then we will wrap up, but these are for you guys to get answers, live answers to your questions so that it can help you in your day-to-day. So what's been happening the last month in process safety? Well, the last month there have been several dust explosions, and there is a heightened awareness potentially on LinkedIn about dust explosions. And so I've seen a lot of posts about dust explosions. This morning I saw one about a pellet making factory. I've seen ones about grain storage and some on coke in burners. So when the burners are shut down, the coke in the burners is dislodged somehow, and then that ignites and can cause an explosion in the burner. So dust explosions continue to remain something that we all need to focus on. And the difference between dust explosions and the other things we may talk about on these calls is that they can happen at almost any site where there is a potential for flammable dust. And that doesn't have to be classified as a high hazard site or a big chemical processing site. It could be something as simple as a grain storage unit, which probably wouldn't be classified under the high hazard site. We've had some extreme weather events continuing. So we had Hurricane Ida in the last month, and there are now potentially several sources of oil leaks in the Gulf of Mexico as a result of Ida going through those assets in the Gulf of Mexico. This is requiring operators to identify the leaks, and obviously, as you can see here, there is monitoring from the environmental agency to identify where leaks are to help operators identify those and manage those. There was a major refinery fire in Durban And as you can see here, 7 people were injured in the refinery explosion. This comes about a year after a major refinery fire in Cape Town, so just the other side of South Africa, and has raised questions about process safety management in South Africa and how the regulator is engaging with operators. There was a large oil spill from a Syrian refinery, and it is said to be the size of New York, and it has reached the coast of Cyprus. We don't have any more information about what caused the oil spill or where it has come from exactly, but we just know that it is there and it is moving on towards Cyprus. There have been several major fires, one in Leamington Spa in the UK, a few I've seen in India, this is just one of them, and then a few in the US as well. And then we've had an update on a previous incident. So in July, we saw a major fire in a German chemical plant. And this month we had an update to say that a chemical reaction is likely to blame for the blast. There is a very useful video by the CSB on reaction hazards. If you have any potential reactive hazards at your facility, I would strongly urge you to watch that recording. So why have I given you this update? Now it's the time to learn from the past. We are seeing these incidents at an alarming frequency, and potentially they've always happened at this frequency, but maybe we are more aware of them now with social media and people are focusing on this. But they are continuing to happen. They are not stopping, and we need to learn from the past. We need to systematically identify our hazards. We need to understand them. So what causes them and what can we do to prevent them? We need to manage them, making sure that those barriers that we said would be in place are always in place and that they are maintained throughout the lifetime of our facility. And we need to remain vigilant. We cannot let any part of our process safety management system weaken, because that can result in a major incident. So I'm gonna close that. I see that Lorraine has joined and she still has talking rights from a previous webinar we were on. Does anybody have anything to add to that? Lorraine, are you seeing the same sort of trend as before, as we're seeing now? Are you seeing the same sort of trend of incidents? Oh, Lorraine's not going to talk today. So
sorry about that.
No worries.
Just clicking the wrong button there for a moment. Yeah, I think you're seeing, the same sort of things coming over time and time again, aren't you? I was talking to somebody locally just yesterday about a similar incident where it feels like they haven't really fully considered the risks. And, a local site to us has had an explosion, thankfully, with no injuries. But yeah, absolutely same sort of processes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also that we have to remember that the ones that we see in the news are probably only the tip of the iceberg, because if there is a near miss, we will not see that on the news. And if there is a fire or explosion which is completely contained within the facility walls and nobody is injured, again, that is unlikely to hit the news. So we are having a lot of these incidents, and as I said, potentially we've always had this many, but to be able to break this trend, we need to really start paying attention to the detail, if we're not already. So Neil has said that we talk a lot about organizational learning, but is it working? So I think from what I have seen in large organizations, organizational learning is very difficult because it takes significant effort and commitment throughout the hiring process and the onboarding process, which is not often applied, especially with contractors who are there for just a short period of time and then moved on because somebody else comes in. You can put all of this learning into your organizational documents, which I've seen work really well, especially for those long-term staff members who are familiar with those documents and can apply all that learning. But if you are having people in your projects or your asset who are not very familiar with those documents, don't know they exist, then even though you have embedded that learning into your requirements, they may not be implemented at your facility. So yeah, I think it depends on how you do it. And actually you need to remember that just by updating a document and then loading it up to the SharePoint doesn't mean that people will know what's going on. And then Neil's added, but senior leadership need to implement these processes and ensure they work. Yes, senior leadership often have a focus on, well, they have many things to worry about, right? They need to run a business, but they also need to run it safely and make sure that these things that we've identified through these incidents are actually working. The problem with process safety is most process safety management systems have in excess of 20 elements. Management need to focus on all 20 elements all the time to make sure they're all working. It's going to be a bit tricky. What I've seen work well is focusing on one area every 6 months or every year. And it's not saying that the other areas are not important at that time. It's just that's what we're going to focus on improving right now, and then we'll move forward. Lorraine, what have you seen work well with senior leadership implementing, lessons learned from incidents and then keeping that alive throughout the organization?
Yeah, well, one of the things I was going to say when I saw Neil's comments was this idea of organisational learning. What I often see is, as an immediate response to an incident, there's toolbox talks, for everybody on site about what happened, about the lessons learned and so on. But then it gets lost. It doesn't get embedded as part of the ongoing knowledge and experience that people need to know. So as you get the turnover of staff, you lose that learning. I think often having it embedded within your competence management systems as part of the knowledge element, that people need to be aware of, that is often one of the ways in which you can actually fix it into that organizational knowledge base, so that people keep being made aware of it. It's not just a one-off hit. It becomes something that every time you go through, all your new starters have to go through that learning, and as part of your competence management processes, you have to revisit it periodically, and that's quite an effective way of getting this sort of experience embedded in your workforce, I think.
Yes, I attended the ICME Hazards Conference last year, and there was a presentation on a facility which had a number of repeat incidents, and they managed to narrow it down to high turnover of staff. So although the incidents were almost identical in different parts of the plant, but they were almost identical with dust explosions, the people who were involved with initiating that incident inadvertently were not aware of the hazards in as much detail as the people who had gone before, because obviously they had experienced the incident. So there is definitely something about onboarding and making sure that information, which is really good information, is transferred over to the new people in your organization. I've also seen, like, if you have a really good understanding of your hazards and a really good understanding of the tasks required to manage those hazards, you can use that information to inform who needs to be trained, rather than trying to do a blanket brush training of everybody, which means that some people will get it and other people will just zone out because it's not applicable to them. And then also having people inducted on the safety case itself. So the safety case is a really, really, really useful document, I found. It always has all the information about the process, how the layout works, and then it has information about the hazards and the barriers you need to manage and how you do that. It has all of that really good information. But once the safety case is written, it's put on the shelf, and nobody else reads it ever again until 5 years later when you have to revise it. But if you could use that as part of your onboarding, I think that would be a really good way of keeping some of this organizational learning alive, and making sure that new recruits understand what they're actually operating with.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. That's my view from what I've seen of safety cases, is they get put on the shelf. They're not really live documents, and they're not the most user-friendly of documents either, which is why I think, use that information to create good, effective training material that's easily understood, that interprets it for the relevant personnel that you're directing it to. And that's why I think, embedding that type of information in a competence management system is useful, because you revisit it periodically and you can keep it up to date and keep it refreshed in people's minds as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, although the regulations in the UK require you to have a safety management system, people often don't see this, how much the safety case relies on the safety management system working really well. And part of the safety management system is your competency management. And the ICME have a really good document on competency management. If you want to have a look at that, it gives you some high level competencies required at different parts of the organization. Yeah, so Neil agrees that the safety case needs to be broken down into parts to utilize it for training. One of the facilities we worked at, there was a safety case booklet, which was issued to anybody who went on site. The safety case booklet had information about the layout, the hazards, where the escape routes were. The one I went on another facility, and they had one, showed you where the escape to sea was, where the temporary refuge was, where the muster points were. So that was a really useful little booklet, and it fitted in your overall pocket, so you could keep it with you when you were out on site. Are there any other questions? I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. If you put them in the Q&A or in the chat, I will answer them, and if Lorraine's happy to continue answering, she could join in as well.
Yeah, that's okay. I wasn't expecting this, Louise.
I know. I know, kind of sprung it on you. At least it wasn't 7 a.m.
That's true. Okay, no problem.
No, has there been any big lessons for you in the last 12 months, which in the last month, where you thought, wow, I could share that with my clients as a good practice or something to learn from?
I'm trying to say, I think one of the things that I got asked to do a job quite recently, earlier this summer, and picking up some work from another consultancy. What was interesting was, whoever they'd worked with before had left not really given clear directions as to what was expected, and then they approached me and asked us to help them deal with this particular action that they've got. And I think it's that idea of being an intelligent customer and knowing what you're asking for, because they'd worked with these people who'd clearly given them the wrong direction. They'd ended up spending an awful lot of time and effort to try and deal with this particular action, and gone off in the wrong direction completely. And when we actually did the work, it took a couple of days to sort it out, do the jobs that they needed. And I think that for me was quite an interesting learning around, when you engage people, do you really know what you're engaging them for? You rely on people who are going to come in and provide that advice and guidance, and sometimes you need to know that you're asking the right questions before you actually engage with people. And that was quite an interesting exercise, I think, from my point of view, as somebody coming in from outside of an organisation.
Do you feel a responsibility as a consultant to educate your clients so that they are in the future an intelligent customer?
Yeah, I think as a consultant, that's part of the job, really, is to try and not just go in and do the job that you've been asked to do, but to help sort of coach and mentor the people that you're working with at the same time, so that they gain that knowledge and can understand why you take the approach that you've taken, so that they learn something and actually become a more informed client in the future, and ideally get to the point where they can take it on for themselves and run with it themselves in the future. That for me is probably the way I would prefer to work, having worked on a site as being one of those people who would have employed consultants in the past. you think about what you would want as the customer, which is actually, I don't really want to keep having to bring outside help in if I've got the resource to do it myself. What I need is people to actually help me to, develop my own understanding and knowledge, and to be able to do at least a certain amount of the work, and then bring other people in for the stuff that I can't do. So that's the way I tend to think about it, really, based on my past experience as well.
Yeah, that's the way that I felt as well, especially having come from, as you said, operating assets. You realize, I mean, to get somebody in, to onboard them and to tell them exactly what it is you want them to do, and then to get it out, that takes time. That takes some of your time. And so if there are things that you could do without those people and then just use them for specific activities, it really does help your day-to-day and being able to deal with what's going on the facility. So yeah, I think it's an important part. But I have seen a lot of clients who've worked with people for a long time, and they don't seem to be any further on the hazard management or risk assessment journey than they may have done when they first engaged. So I think it's definitely something that we all should do, but it's not something that we do all do.
Yeah, I think it depends on the client as well, because sometimes the client will not have the resource to do that. They work on a basis that their resource is to bring outside personnel in to help support it, and that's fine if that is their strategy. But I do think, as a consultant, part of our responsibility is to try and educate and coach people as we go along that route, so that they get to that point where they decide whether they want to do it for themselves or not. And if they decide that it's lack of resource, at least they've got a bit more information as to what sort of resource they need to bring in to support them in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Because as you say, you can bring in the wrong resource, or you can ask the resource to do the wrong thing. And then you'll end up with having spent money and not achieving the objective because you didn't really understand what you wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously there's a learning curve on this as well. But
yeah, of course.
It's sort of starting to help people sort through that sort of learning path, I think.
We've had a question from Abdullah. And so he said, do you see artificial intelligence and digitalization helping reduce process incidents? So my take on this is yes, most definitely. Even the digitalization we've seen since the 80s, moving from pneumatic to sort of PLC logic and that sort of thing, and relays, that has helped reduce process safety incidents. The problem is if you don't do that hazard identification and the risk assessment well, even if you have all the digitalization, artificial intelligence, if you have all of that, you're not going to be able to manage your hazard well, because you haven't even identified that it's there, or you haven't identified that it's a significant concern. So this first step in the process is almost the key in any management system, is to identify and then assess the severity. If you know that it's quite a significant incident, potential incident, you can then manage that. But if you think it's nothing, or you don't even know it's there, you can't do anything proactive to try and manage it and reduce the likelihood. And that's either through digitalization, you can't train artificial intelligence to look for things if you don't know what to look for. So all of that requires that hazard identification at the beginning. And once you've got your hazards identified, you can then move forward. And I think that actually, even though I see that these things can help us in the future, I think we have all the tools that we need available to us at this moment. It's just that we don't often do that first step very well, or we do that first step, but it doesn't follow through to the remaining steps, and then parts of our system fall down. Lorraine, what do you think about these things?
I mean, I certainly agree that automation, AI can help to improve safety. I think in doing so, we need to make sure that we still keep the people engaged with that process. You can't rule out the human beings, because there's plenty of incidents where the actual automated systems work, but they've been overridden or they've not been maintained or tested. And so absolutely agree with what you were saying there, Louise, about you start with the hazard identification and what your actual risks are and manage it, and you put your automation system in. But you also need to make sure that you understand what the people's role in managing those risks are that sits alongside the automation or helps to support the automation. I think there's also a tendency to say, well, you know, we've got a control system, but if it goes wrong, then, you know, the person will step into the breach. And actually, is that a realistic expectation? Because if the person hasn't been involved in actively controlling a system, to expect them to come in, to step in and take control of it, especially as it's going out of control, which is normally the situation, it's a big ask for us, tall order for somebody to step in and do that at the last minute without having a full mental model of what's actually been going on. So automation's great, but we need to think about how we involve people in that process when we're designing the automation as well.
Yeah, and I think also it's keeping them engaged, as you said, but like keeping their competence up. I've seen a lot of sort of virtual rooms where they upset the plant and then check that the operator can respond. So those are really great training rooms, but they are very expensive to do. But maybe with the increase in digitalization, maybe you don't need a special room to do it anymore. Maybe you could just do it with your home computer or a few different screens. You know, maybe you could visualize things, but also digitalization brings in the other risks of the cybersecurity attacks and so on. But I have seen what you said, you know, if everything works all the time, okay, and people don't worry about that, then they're worrying about something else and they're fresh on the other thing. And when that thing that works all the time starts going wrong, they actually have no idea how to fix it because they haven't even looked at it, or they don't even know what it does anymore because it just works all the time. We don't have to worry about it. Yeah. So yeah, it's a challenge, I think, to balance those two.
It almost goes back to that idea of organizational knowledge. You know, in the past, when it was installed, there would have been people who understood the ins and outs of how it worked and why it was there and what it was there to control. And that's why it becomes important to embed that knowledge in the organisation as well, so it doesn't get lost. So yeah, and I've had experience of that as well, having worked at a place for over 20 years. You know, things that sort of process design that I was involved in my early days there, and then sort of moved on into different parts of the business. You know, coming back 10 years later and getting asked questions and finding people's understanding of some of those design features are completely different from what they'd actually gone in for in the first place was quite an interesting experience. So yeah, absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, keeping that information up to date and keeping people interested in that information, because we can only retain so much and we already have information overload. We've had a comment from Neil to say that he was once involved in an incident where the operator intervention made the incident worse. There have been several of those incidents where operators getting involved actually make things worse. I think that the T2 laboratories is a good example of where the operators getting involved improved the situation. So before they started to have the runaway reaction, there was in the order of 10 people around the reactor trying to figure out what the problem was. And when the manager came in, you know, he had been one of the operators. He understood the system. He realized things were not going well. He just got people to get out of there. So even if your only response is to get out and let the ESD system do its work, you know, that could in itself be a useful action.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, you know, I do a lot of work around safety critical tasks and identifying those tasks. And often it's those emergency response type activities that are not as clearly defined as we might like to think that they are. And I totally agree that, you know, sometimes it is just evacuate the building, you know, and if there's some simple stuff that you can do to make it safe from a distance, then that might be good enough. But so long as everybody's clear on what that response to the situation should actually be, then that's what you need to get embedded.
Yeah. And you know, operator inaction, as we saw with both Piper Alpha and the Macondo incident, operators on the adjacent platform in Piper Alpha were unwilling, even though they had the information in front of them that the facility was on fire and that they were probably feeding the fire, they were unwilling to make a decision. And they, having a lot of artificial intelligence and digitalization may mean that they lose confidence in their decisions that they would make in that split second, and therefore they may be unwilling and delay. And then in Macondo, again, they were unwilling to take the action to share the pipe, even though they had information to support that they were out of control, because they wanted to get the rig off of location and move on. So they had other pressures. So yes, in some cases, I think it will help, but it could also inadvertently make things worse, especially if you take away people's confidence or knowledge about the system.
Yeah.
I've had a question about from Pier Paolo. So hi Pier Paolo, glad you could join us. Have you been involved in a hazard and risk assessment following introduction of newer technologies, particularly when both older and newer coexist? So I've been involved in a lot of hazard and risk assessment processes. You know, sometimes, even though it's an existing technology, it's very, very new to that facility. They've never operated, they don't have anybody there who understands the system. And they're relying completely on the vendor to explain to them what the hazards are associated with that system. So I haven't been specifically on a completely new technology, but I have been involved in a lot of hazard risk assessments where people are bringing in something which they have no idea how to operate. And sometimes, yes, that it has to operate concurrent with the existing one so that they can maintain that availability that they want to maintain until the old one can be decommissioned once the new one's commissioned. This is tricky, I think, especially if you don't have anybody in the room who's familiar with the new system from an operator perspective. So often you have the vendor and they're very familiar with the design part, but they might not have that operator part. And then you can result in, as I'm sure Lorraine knows, taking a lot of design flaws into the operating phase and then people having to figure out workarounds, which obviously is a situation where you don't want to be in. So yeah, so if you can get somebody from within your organization who works at a different facility who has that, or somebody from outside the organization as independent who has experience of that, would be really good in those assessments. I found that kind of the key role in these kind of assessments where something's completely new to the people in the assessment. What are your thoughts, Lorraine?
Yeah, very, very similar, to be honest. I mean, I was involved in a new plant design and installation quite a long time ago, when we were in exactly the situation where it was a new technology for our company, but the vendor obviously was very, very familiar with it. The only thing I would say was that the hazard and risk assessment process was much more limited at the time, because, you know, probably going back over 20 years now, and I would say it wasn't covered in the sort of level of detail that I would expect to happen today. And certainly there is that balance between what the vendors experience with the technology is, and then how it integrates with your own plant processes, which they don't know, and which they need to, you know, you need to work quite closely with the vendor to understand what the risks might be associated with that. So yeah, it's about bringing both of those together, I think, and understanding how the integration is together, where those boundaries actually meet, is often the piece that becomes most difficult, I think.
Yeah, Neil's added that training starting early, actually before implementation, is a good way of getting people's competence up, so that when things do go wrong, either during commissioning or operation, then they have the information. But he said that this is not often included in the project costs, and then becomes an operational problem, but then they've already started up and the hazard is present.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. Yeah. Training never seems to get covered in project costs. I think, you know, what we see now is the advent of human factors integration plans, which should, you know, be part of the project process and sort of link in with the project stage gates, so that you do think of those human requirements as part of the project or the process design, and also the other elements that need to be included in the project, which would obviously include training and development of the people who are going to operate, maintain, etc., which is part of it. And I think if you can embed that type of approach into your project, then it would allow you to think about the right sort of things at the appropriate stage.
Yeah, and I think the other thing key to introducing anything new is to break the system down into small enough parts that it can be understood. So almost all new things have some old elements in. Yeah. And you can then figure out how those elements that you already understand, or maybe there's a good understanding in the industry, how those elements fail. And then as a result, in those sort of team discussions like the hazard, HAZOP, and the LOPA, you can figure out the sequence of events based on the understanding of those smaller initiating events. When you're trying to look at a new thing which, you know, you've not looked at, if you're looking at too big a slice, it just all becomes a blur, and you don't really understand the in-betweens of how things can go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, my experience from training is I've spoken to, you know, a number of people who are, you know, technical experts, and often I find that they delve right into the detail and at the small elements, and sometimes forget to give you the overview of where it fits in the overall scheme of things. And I think that's you know, when you're talking about technical training, it's about bringing the technical expertise together with somebody who actually can train.
Yes.
Because there's a skill in training as well. And so, you know, combining that and you know, pulling it together as a coherent program without just providing bits of information and you can't quite see where they fit together is sometimes one of the risks. And again, seeing that the people who really understand the processes often aren't necessarily great trainers. You need to extract that.
No, that's right.
And find a way of relaying that effectively.
Yeah, and death by PowerPoint is never good either.
Absolutely.
And then Chris has shared with us that adequate training should be part of pre-startup safety reviews. So we shouldn't be allowed to start up unless the people who are going to operate and maintain have been adequately trained in the operation of the safety critical elements of this new system, whatever that may be.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think it's something that needs to be thought about before the PSSR, to be honest. You know, it needs to be part of the project plan, because otherwise, if you get to the PSSR stage, and that's the point in which you're starting about training, you're getting ready to start up, and often there's no
time,
running out of time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think having it as a check, you know, because I found a lot of the things that are on the PSSR, the project managers and that they care about that, because they know that if they don't meet those requirements, they're not going to get through and be able to start up. And so having the training as a requirement, which will be checked, I think that can be really useful in driving the right behavior throughout the project.
Yeah, and again, it depends on the size of the project, of course.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then Chris has just said, he said it should be part of the project plan, and the PSSR is just that final check.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, well, we haven't had any more questions, and Chris has just added that the project manager needs to identify that operations are involved from the start of the project. Yeah, and that's tricky, because you need to get someone who's sufficiently competent who couldn't be released from operations to be involved in these hazard identification studies. And that it, with all the pressures that we have on our budgets, the time that to execute things, it's just, yeah. But you know, you need that, and that's why you know, previously in the olden days, but you know, there used to be people who were more senior, operators or technicians or mechanics or engineers. They didn't have a lot of responsibilities. Their responsibilities was to hand over their knowledge in the form of training, etc., to the younger generation, and to put input into these projects. But now there's just not the money or the resource to be able to do that, and that's a big concern.
Yeah, certainly one of the risks of headcount reduction, as you see, you know, operating teams reduce, you don't have that flexibility in the same way to release people for some of the other activities that go on the site. Yeah,
I mean, I've had quite a number of workshops cancelled well, not cancelled, but deferred, because when we've had everybody lined up, and then all of a sudden on that day or the day before or 2 days before, the person who's critically needed is not available because there's no knowledge in the organization. An upset happens, they need to deal with that, they can't deal with this. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to wrap up, and I will just share the last little bit of the presentation, unless Lorraine, there's anything you want to add before we wrap up.
No, nothing else from me, thanks.
Okay, and if I can push this button, it might work. There we go. So what's coming up in September? So I'm delivering a couple of ICME trainings, ICME HAZOP Leader and ICME Local training. I know the local training is fully booked at the moment. I think there's a few places on the HAZOP Leader training, and the local training will be repeated again in November. So if you've missed this chance, you can take that chance. We've got the next session on the 6th of October. We'll try and do it around noon, but it depends on work commitments. And then if you haven't seen on the website, there are some useful resources, free templates on HAZOP and LOPA, checklists, etc., etc. So, and then obviously there are all the resources we've mentioned today, like the CCPS, the CSB, the HSE, loads of useful information on different topics, depending on what you're looking for. So have a look through my feed on LinkedIn, because I share a lot of that information, or get in touch with either myself or Lorraine if there's anything specific we can help you with. So thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for the impromptu participation in a live sense, because I know you were planning on participating on the text, and look forward to seeing you all next month, and keep engaging, keep safe, and keep vigilant.